Chancellor Rachel Reeves, faced with tough questions over the Angela Rayner tax scandal, could not hold her ground. Instead of strength, what came through was stuttering hesitation and a desperate attempt to cover cracks that only grew wider as the interview went on. For a politician meant to project authority and calm, this performance was nothing short of a disaster. Watch closely, because every pause, every stumble, and every nervous glance reveals far more than the words she struggled to say. It began like any ordinary interview, but within minutes, the tone shifted. Pressed directly on whether Angela Rayner could remain in post after admitting she had failed to pay the correct stamp duty, Rachel Reeves froze. She insisted, again and again, that she had full confidence in her deputy, but the words came out broken, riddled with ums and uhs. The Chancellor's voice trembled, her delivery faltered, and rather than controlling the narrative, she looked as though she had lost it completely. Viewers expecting clarity were left watching a car crash unfold in real time. Reeves attempted to paint Rayner's failure as a simple mistake, just an error, nothing more. But every time she repeated that line, the lack of conviction was painfully obvious. Instead of defending her colleague with strength, her stammering only fueled suspicion that she didn't truly believe what she was saying. This wasn't the confident tone of a leader standing by her team. It was the nervous voice of someone desperately clinging to a pre-prepared script that was already falling apart. The interviewer pressed harder. When exactly did Reeves learn about this so-called mistake? Again, her response crumbled. She muttered about definitive advice coming in on Wednesday, about court injunctions being lifted, about challenging family circumstances. But none of it landed. Instead, the contradictions piled up, the timeline grew murky, and the excuses sounded more like evasions than answers. This is where the humiliation became undeniable. Reeves was visibly rattled. Her words tangled her authority evaporating. Every attempt to steady herself only led to more stuttering, more hesitation, and more fuel for her critics. For a politician responsible for Britain's finances, the inability to deliver clear, confident answers on live television is not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. If she can't handle a few pointed questions about a colleague's tax bill, how can she be trusted to handle the storms of a real financial crisis? And that's the key question. What Britain saw in that interview wasn't a leader ready to steady the economy. It was a chancellor stripped of composure, exposed under the pressure of scrutiny, and humiliated in front of millions. The very image of control she so desperately needs to project crumbled, leaving only doubt, unease, and the uncomfortable truth that the Treasury may not be in safe hands. The fallout from this disastrous performance was immediate. Political allies looked uneasy, opponents smelled blood, and the public were left wondering how such a senior figure could appear so unprepared. Reeves had walked into the interview, hoping to calm the storm surrounding Angela Rayner, but instead she only intensified it. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the headlines were already writing themselves. Stuttering Chancellor humiliated on live TV. What stood out wasn't just the lack of fluency, but the lack of conviction. Every time she insisted that Rayner had simply made an error, the words rang hollow. The more she repeated the excuse, the less believable it sounded. And viewers picked up on that. They saw a politician struggling not only to defend her colleague, but to defend her own credibility. In politics, perception is everything. And what people saw was weakness. Critics have been quick to point out that this is not the first time Reeves has faltered under pressure. But this interview felt different. This wasn't a slip of the tongue or a minor stumble. This was a full-blown collapse in composure at a moment when the country expects stability. When the economy is fragile, when families are struggling with rising costs, the one thing Britain cannot afford is a chancellor who looks rattled and unsure of herself. As the questioning continued, Reeves attempted to buy herself time with long pauses and rambling diversions. She leaned heavily on Angela Rayner's family circumstances, hoping to win sympathy. But instead, it came across as a deflection. The facts remained. A deputy prime minister had underpaid her taxes, and the chancellor could not explain clearly why this had only now come to light. Each excuse sounded thinner than the last, and each hesitation only deepened the sense of crisis. What made matters worse was the contrast. Instead of appearing as the steady, confident voice of government, Reeves looked cornered, like a politician trapped in a story she couldn't control. And that is the real humiliation. Because in politics, weakness invites attack. Rivals will not forget how easily she crumbled. Colleagues will not forget how exposed she looked. And the public will not forget the uneasy feeling that the person steering the nation's economy cannot even steer an interview without falling apart. By the time the interview reached its midpoint, the humiliation was complete. Rachel Reeves, who had entered the studio hoping to defend Angela Rayner, found herself defending her own competence. Every question seemed to tie her in knots. Every attempt at reassurance only magnified the unease. Instead of shifting the spotlight away from scandal, she had placed it squarely on herself. The interviewer pressed again. If Reeves truly believed in integrity, why had it taken days for the truth about the unpaid stamp duty to come out? Reeves stammered through her answer, referring once more to definitive advice and complicated circumstances. But by now the audience had heard enough. The specifics barely mattered. What mattered was the delivery, hesitant, faltering, uncertain. And in politics, uncertainty is fatal. For ordinary viewers watching at home, the impression was striking. This was not the composed Chancellor guiding Britain through tough economic waters. This was a nervous figure struggling to string a sentence together, visibly rattled by questions she should have expected. The more she spoke, the less confident she appeared, and the more fragile her authority seemed. And then came the critical moment. Asked whether Britain could still trust Angela Rayner to set an example when she herself had broken tax rules, Reeves paused. The silence was long enough to make viewers uncomfortable. When she finally answered, her words were drowned in filler, you know. It was the sound of a politician lost in her own defence, unable to project the very authority her position demands. Commentators immediately seized on the performance. Social media lit up with clips of the stuttering, the long pauses, the nervous glances. Words like humiliated, exposed, and disaster dominated the conversation. For Rachel Reeves, this was more than a bad interview. It was a defining moment. Because once the perception of weakness sets in, it is almost impossible to shake off. The humiliation was not just personal. It raised deeper questions about the government itself. If the Chancellor cannot defend her deputy on something as basic as paying the right amount of tax, how can she be trusted to defend the country's economy in a crisis? If she cannot deliver clarity in a television interview, how can she deliver stability in the Treasury? These are the doubts now circulating in the minds of voters, colleagues, and critics alike, and they are not going away anytime soon. As the interview drew to its uneasy close, one thing was clear. Rachel Reeves had not reassured the public. If anything, she had amplified the doubts already hanging over her leadership. Her repeated stuttering, her inability to give straight answers, and her desperate attempts to frame Angela Rayner's tax scandal as a mere mistake painted a picture of weakness that is hard to erase. For many viewers, the lingering question was no longer about Rayner at all. It was about Reeves herself. Can Britain really trust this woman with the keys to the Treasury? The humiliation went far beyond a few awkward pauses. What Reeves suffered on live television was the complete erosion of authority. When a politician falters this badly, it is not forgotten. Clips of her stumbles have already been replayed across social media, dissected by commentators, and shared by political opponents who sense blood in the water. Every replay reinforces the same image. A chancellor who looked overwhelmed, unsteady, and utterly incapable of defending her government under pressure. And this matters. The chancellor's role is not just about balancing spreadsheets, it's about commanding confidence. The markets listen, businesses listen, families struggling with bills listen. They all look to the Treasury for stability and certainty. But Reeves gave them the opposite. Her interview projected doubt, fragility, and weakness. And when the person charged with safeguarding the economy appears shaky, the entire government begins to look shaky too. Critics have already drawn a chilling comparison. If Reeves cannot withstand a tough interview about her deputy's tax affairs, how will she perform when faced with a real financial storm? Imagine the pressure of a market crash, a banking crisis, or a run on the pound. In those moments, Britain needs a chancellor who can stay calm, steady, and authoritative. But this interview has left many wondering if Rachel Reeves is built for that challenge, or if she will crumble again when the stakes are even higher. The humiliation also handed a gift to her opponents. Nigel Farage wasted no time in declaring that Angela Rayner's position is untenable, predicting she may not survive the scandal. But behind his words lurked another, sharper attack, the implication that Reeves herself cannot be trusted. Farage and others will seize on this interview as proof that Labour's leadership is fragile, that its senior figures are unprepared, and that its promises of stability are nothing more than empty words. In politics, perception can be more powerful than fact, and the perception left behind by this disaster is devastating. Inside Labour, unease is growing. Reeves is meant to be one of the steady hands in Keir Starmer's team, a figure who can project competence and win over cautious voters. But after this performance, even her allies are whispering. They may not say it in public yet, but in private, the doubts are real. Did Reeves just expose the weakness at the very heart of Labour's economic message? Has the image of authority and control been fatally undermined by one disastrous interview? And then there is the public. Ordinary voters who do not follow the twists and turns of Westminster gossip saw something raw and unforgettable. A senior politician humiliated live on television. They may not remember every detail of the Angela Rayner tax scandal. They may not recall every timeline and technicality. But they will remember the stuttering, the hesitation, the unease in Rachel Reeves's voice. They will remember how she looked cornered, unconvincing, and out of her depth. In politics, these impressions last. They stick, and they shape the way voters see leaders for years to come. So, what happens now? Reeves will no doubt attempt to brush off the embarrassment, to insist that her words were taken out of context, to claim that her colleague's mistake is being exaggerated. But none of that changes the reality of what millions of people saw with their own eyes. They saw a chancellor humiliated. They saw weakness. They saw doubt. And once that image takes hold, no amount of spin can erase it. In the end, this was more than an interview. It was a turning point. A moment when the mask slipped and the reality of Rachel Reeves's leadership was exposed. For her supporters, it was a sobering warning. For her opponents, it was an opportunity. And for Britain, it was a reminder that those in power must be able to withstand pressure, because pressure will always come. Reeves failed that test, and the humiliation she suffered will follow her into every debate, every headline, and every moment of scrutiny that lies ahead. The question now is not just about Angela Rayner's tax scandal, it is about Rachel Reeves herself. Can she recover from this humiliation, or has one disastrous interview already sealed the public's perception of her as a chancellor unfit for the storms to come? That answer remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. The storm surrounding Rachel Reeves is far from over. In fact, the fallout from this single interview is only beginning to ripple outward, and the consequences may be far greater than anyone inside Labour anticipated. Because humiliation in politics doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. It lingers, it spreads, and it shapes the battlefield long after the interview itself fades from the news cycle. Already, the clips of Reeves stumbling and stuttering are being weaponised across social media. Short, brutal edits are circulating, her eyes darting, her voice faltering, her hands twitching nervously. These snippets are being shared not just by opponents, but by ordinary people who found the spectacle too awkward to ignore. And that's the real danger. Once a political figure becomes the subject of ridicule, the damage is exponential. Laughter erodes respect, humiliation erodes trust, and without trust, a chancellor is finished before the battle even begins. The timing could not be worse. Britain is staring down an uncertain economic horizon, with inflation biting, growth stagnating, and families squeezed harder than ever. In such conditions, the nation looks desperately for reassurance from its leaders. But Reeves, instead of projecting strength, has projected fragility. Instead of inspiring confidence, she has stirred doubt. And in politics, doubt is poison. It seeps silently into every corner, weakening even the strongest foundations. Her defenders will argue that everyone makes mistakes, that even seasoned politicians stumble occasionally under pressure. But this was no ordinary stumble. This was a collapse in composure at a moment when clarity and steadiness were absolutely required. To ordinary voters, it looked as though Reeves simply wasn't ready for the weight of her office. And that impression, once lodged in the public mind, becomes almost impossible to dislodge. Meanwhile, her critics are wasting no time. Nigel Farage has already painted the scandal as proof of Labour's dishonesty, a sign that the party is not fit to govern. The Conservatives, still reeling from their own crises, have found new energy in attacking Reeves as weak, ineffective, and unreliable. Even within Labour's own ranks, whispers are growing louder. If Reeves cannot steady herself now, how can she possibly steady the economy later? The humiliation has also had another, subtler effect. It has shifted the story. What began as a scandal about Angela Rayner's unpaid taxes has now become a story about Rachel Reeves's credibility. The Deputy Prime Minister may have been the original subject of scrutiny, but it is the Chancellor whose reputation is most damaged. And that shift is deadly in politics. Because while Rayner can perhaps escape with a fine or a quiet apology, Reeves cannot so easily escape the shadow of her humiliation. The stuttering, the faltering answers, the sheer lack of composure, that image will follow her everywhere. And perhaps most troubling of all is what this says about leadership. The true test of a leader is not in times of calm, but in moments of crisis. Anyone can read from a script when the waters are still. But when the storm hits, when the questions are sharp and the spotlight blinding, that is when leaders reveal who they really are. Rachel Reeves has now revealed herself to the nation. And what the nation saw was not strength, it was fragility, it was doubt, it was humiliation. As the dust settles, the long-term consequences remain uncertain. Will Reeves manage to claw back her reputation with stronger performances in the weeks to come? Or has the damage already set in, too deep to repair? History is not kind to politicians who fail under pressure. The public rarely forgets. The media never lets go, and rivals never stop exploiting weakness once they have seen it. Reeves may find that no matter how many future interviews she nails, no matter how many polished speeches she gives, the image of her stuttering through this disaster will remain burned into the public memory. In the end, this was not just an interview gone wrong. It was a turning point. A moment that crystallized doubts already whispered about Rachel Reeves and broadcast them in brutal clarity to the nation. A moment that shifted the conversation from tax scandals to leadership crises. A moment that left millions asking the same uneasy question. If this is the steady hand Britain's economy is supposed to rest on, what happens when the real storms come? The humiliation may fade from the headlines, but the damage is permanent. Rachel Reeves wanted to shield her colleague. Instead, she exposed herself. And in politics, exposure is fatal.